Don't you dare argue with my wife in her house. My son Caleb said it with a force that made the coffee mug shiver against the counter. His voice cracked the air like a whip. I stood frozen in my own kitchen, feeling as if I'd been slapped. He called it her house. But we were in my house. In the house I built brick by brick, working day and night for 30 years. I didn't argue. I just smiled, because some earthquakes start with silence. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Vanessa leaned in the doorway with that careful smile she wears when she thinks she has already won, red polish on her nails. A perfume that does not belong in these rooms. She did not touch me. She did not need to. Her face said it all. This was not a discussion, it was a verdict delivered without a judge. Steam lifted from the kettle in thin white ribbons. It curled between us like a warning. I watched it rise and quiet myself the way you quiet a frightened animal. Caleb did not notice my hands. Or maybe he did and chose not to look. The boy who once pressed a fevered forehead into my shoulder now squared his stance against me. I heard the echo of years of lullabies in the spaces between his words, and it made the kitchen feel smaller than it had ever been. He said I was being unfair. He said Vanessa lived here now and wanted to make the place comfortable. He said I needed to stop turning small things into battles. Vanessa watched the little monologue as if it were a show she had already seen and liked, a tilt of her head. A tiny breath through the nose that sounded like patience, not kindness. I kept my voice even. I said I wasn't arguing, son. I was remembering whose hands built these walls. My words did not rise. They landed softly and stayed there. He blinked but did not soften. He said again that it was her space too. He wanted me to hear that word and obey it. Space. As if the years were an old couch that could be hauled out to the curb. Silence spread like a stain across the countertop. In that silence, 1,000 little pictures flashed by. A hammer lying beside a half-driven nail. A recipe card with my mother's handwriting smeared by butter. 2 school backpacks collapsed by the back door. Those images did not ask for attention. They simply stood there and waited to see what I would choose to be. I refused to perform. I did not raise a hand. I did not raise a tone. I reached for the mug with its tiny crack near the handle and poured the coffee anyway. The steam touched my face like a memory of winter breath. I let the heat steady me. I thought of the first winter after Frank died, when the pipes froze and I learned how to bleed radiators by flashlight. I had no audience then, only 2 boys in a house that did not care whether I cried. Vanessa shifted her weight and glanced at the refrigerator door. The photos of the boys were no longer there. Last week, she stacked them in a drawer and replaced them with sleek magnets that spelled out the names of cities she had visited. Rome, Miami, Aspen. My life turned into souvenirs I never asked for. I said nothing about it then. I say nothing about it now. Caleb reached for the plant on the windowsill, as if to make a point about light and space. Not today. Not that. My hand moved without my permission and stopped his. He looked at my fingers on his wrist the way a stranger looks at a wrong turn. I let go first. He noticed. He wanted triumph. I gave him air. "This is why people break, Eleanor," Vanessa said, voice honeyed like a tutorial. "They cling to the old and call it love." She did not look at me when she said it. She looked at him. The insult was not for me. It was bait for him. He took it. He always does when he is trying not to disappoint anyone. He asked me to be reasonable. He asked me to give new habits a chance. He asked me to stop making the kitchen into a battlefield. I looked at the kettle. The flame had been left too high. I turned it down and watched the water settle from a fierce boil into something manageable. That felt like a lesson no one else in the room would study. Her house. The phrase returned like a small stone in a shoe. For years I have carried stones and called them part of the road. You can walk far that way if you are stubborn enough. But there is a moment when you must sit on a porch step, take off the shoe, and look at what you have allowed inside. I thought of Luke for a heartbeat. His face when he visits on Sundays, the way he notices if the salt is not where it used to be, the questions he doesn't ask because he is careful with my peace. I did not bring his name into this room. I would not turn one son into a weapon against the other. That is not the kind of mother I have ever been. Caleb tried to end the scene by telling me what would change in the kitchen, where the spices would go, which shelf would be cleared. He spoke as if policies and cabinets could fix a wound that had my name on it. I stood with my spine against the counter and let him list his future. In the space between his words, I heard Vanessa's laughter from last week when she told her friend on the phone that this place was charming for now. Charming is what people call a life they plan to renovate out of existence. I said enough. Not loud, not sharp. I placed the spoon in the sink so gently that the metal barely kissed porcelain. Both of them looked at me. The kettle hummed like an insect, constant and small. I told my son I would not fight him. I told him he had already decided where he stands. I told him I could live with his decision. I could not live with the lie of pretending I did not hear it. He started to argue again, the same points, the same phrases, and that is when the understanding slid into place with the quiet click of a key turning. Her house, he had said, not our home. Not the place of his childhood. Her house. He had crossed over to where I could not follow and remain myself. Vanessa's smile grew a fraction then, something so slight you would miss it if you were not the woman who taught this boy to tie his shoes on these tiles. I saw the small victory she fed on. Not love, not a partnership, possession. She needed a stage to stand above someone. Today I was on the stairs. I finished my coffee. The heat was already leaving it. Warmth goes first when the window is left open to the weather. I set the cup down, and its ring printed a faint circle on the counter. If anyone looked later, they would think it was nothing. A mark, a little water. A cloth would erase it, but the hand that made it would remember. Caleb asked where I was going. He always hears footsteps and forgets I am the one who built the floor. I told him I needed some air. Vanessa said, "Take your time," as if she were doing me a kindness. I did not answer her. I walked past them, and the scent of her perfume broke apart in the draft from the back door. Outside, the porch boards accepted my weight the way old friends do. The sky above the maple tree was the color of faded denim. A car passed on the street and then another. Life kept moving as if kitchens were not breaking a few feet away. I stood there and let the breath of the day fill my ribs. My hands steadied at my sides. In the yard, a bird picked at the soil near the stone path and lifted away with a single beat. That quiet was not empty. It was a room inside me I had not visited in a long time. When I stepped back into the kitchen, the steam had thinned to a ghost. The smell of coffee lingered under the perfume. Caleb had his back to me. Vanessa had taken my place at the counter and was tracing the lip of the mug as if it belonged to her hand. I did not take it from her. I did not take anything from anyone. I told my son I heard him. I told him I would not ask him to choose. I told him there would be changes. He asked what kind. I said the kind that returns a name to its proper place. He frowned as if the words were a math problem he did not want to solve. Vanessa watched me with a new sort of attention that had nothing to do with decor. I lifted the kettle, poured a little water into the sink, and turned off the flame. The burner ticked as it cooled. I placed my palm over that soft heat and felt it fade. Things cool, things settle. Things that are too hot to hold become manageable when you decide not to feed the fire. I set the mug down. My fingers lingered on the ceramic the way you touch a forehead to be sure the fever has passed. The last thread of steam unwound into the air and vanished without a sound. In that thin moment, the kitchen walls seemed to breathe with me. I saw the scar near the baseboard where a toy truck took a corner too fast. I saw the tiny chip in the tile where a plate slipped from a tired hand. The room offered its proof. We were here. We made a life that left marks. I let the silence stand one beat longer. Then I stepped away from the counter. My eyes found the back door window. Light slid across the porch step like a hand turning a page. The first memory rose as steady as a foundation line. The day we poured the footings. The smell of wet cement. Frank laughed in the cold air. The certainty that if we placed the first brick true, the walls would carry everything we asked of them. I held that image the way you hold a compass, and I knew exactly where the next step would lead. When Frank said we'd build a home from nothing, I didn't think he meant it literally. I thought he meant we would fill second-hand rooms with first-hand laughter, that we would buy chairs with wobbly legs and steady them with folded paper until we could afford better. Then we found a square of ground the color of old pennies, a parcel pitched slightly toward the creek, and he grinned like a man who had just been told yes after a long winter of no. There was nothing on that dirt but weeds and wind. He said nothing is a kind of invitation. I said invitations usually come with an address. He knelt and pressed his palm into the soil and told me to memorize the way it felt, because one day it would be under our feet, and we would call it ours. We were young in the way tired people are young when they decide not to quit. The first week, we cleared rocks and found the shape of our foundation by walking it until our steps knew the pattern. I learned the smell of rain on clay. He taught me the difference between a line that only looks straight and a line that is true. At dusk, we ate bread in the bed of his old truck and listened to crickets test the dark. He said, "This house will carry your laughter when I no longer can," and I rolled my eyes at the place in his voice where jokes sound like prayers. I told him to quit making promises he would have to live a long time to keep. He said promises are only bricks until you stack them and stand beneath them. We poured footings on a morning that tasted like metal and hope. The cement arrived in a rumbling belly and slid out like river mud. Frank took off his wedding ring because he'd once seen a man lose a finger to a spinning tool, and he was superstitious about keeping all 10. He tucked the ring into his pocket while we guided the chute, and somewhere in the dance between lifting and lowering, the ring slipped free and disappeared into that gray heart. We laugh the way you do when something small and irreplaceable is lost in front of you and you're not ready to admit what it means. He said, "It will be the secret bone that holds us up." I pressed my fingers into the surface like a blessing before it cured, and told myself that love sometimes lives behind walls we can't touch. The framing went up in ribs. He named each truss like a ship. I hammered until the skin of my hands learned to be useful. When we hung the front door for the first time, it stuck at the top and rasped at the bottom. Frank planned it until it whispered into place. He stepped back and tipped his head as if listening to a choir. He said, "Hear that?" I heard nothing. He said, "Exactly. Good rooms know when to be quiet." Life layered itself between studs. Caleb learned to walk by hunting the sun rectangles on the floor and stepping from one island of light to the next. Luke came 2 winters later, swaddled in a blanket that never quite lost the scent of soap and cedar. I kissed their hair at the threshold every night like an old ritual I had accidentally invented. We could not afford trim in those years, so we painted the edges the color of patience and told the boys it was deliberate. Luke would press his nose to fresh plaster and announce that our walls smelled warm. Then he would look at me and say, "Mom, our walls smell like you baked them." I told him that meant the rooms were hungry, and we should feed them with stories. He grew up believing rooms could starve. I let him believe it. It made him careful. There was a season when money was a rumor, and sleep was a rumor, and we slept beside half-built walls, our breath fogging in the cold because the furnace had not yet made up its mind to live here with us. The creek rose once and threatened the edge of our world, but we dug a trench by flashlight, and the water agreed to pass by without taking anything important. I learned to read the weather by the way the porch boards creaked in the morning. Frank learned to smooth rough edges in wood and in people. He taught Caleb to carry a level as if it were more than a tool. He taught Luke that nails do less damage if you start them with a gentle tap and then commit. The day he did not come home arrived like a phone ringing in an empty room, a call from a site he had only meant to visit for an hour, a cable, a sway, a mistake in the logic of weight. They told me he did not suffer long. That is what people say when they do not know what to do with another person's ruin. I stood in our unfinished kitchen and listened for the choir of good rooms Frank had sworn I would hear. The house held its breath. Caleb was 15 and tried to be taller than grief. Luke curled into the corner near the back door and would not speak for a day. I told the boys we would not let sorrow take our walls. I told them their father's ring lived in the footings and would not let us fall. When I said it, I believed it. On the days I did not believe it, I said it again until belief agreed to sit beside me. There is a myth that men keep houses standing. I learned that houses keep women standing when the men go quiet. I kept the roof from complaining with patches that looked like bandages. I learned to measure 2 times and cut once, and then check myself anyway, because grief is a slippery tape. I took in hems at a dining table that remembered the weight of nails before it remembered the weight of fabric. The needle sang through denim and cotton. At night, that song softened the edges of my fear. The boys fell asleep to the tiny tide of stitches. I ironed a school shirt that had been patched so many times the patches had their own geography. Caleb hugged me from behind once and mumbled that it smelled like morning already. I pretended I did not need to sit down. Luke became my Sabbath without knowing he was saving me. He asked me to let him help in ways that did not insult my pride. He noticed when the salt was not where it used to be and moved it back without comment. He appeared at my elbow with a bucket when the gutter overflowed and with a bandage when the latter caught my ankle instead of the sky. When teenage years taught him how to sigh, he still remembered to open the porch door for me. When his voice deepened, he used it to ask if I had eaten before he fed himself. He kept my edges from fraying. He did this with the casual devotion of someone who believes the right thing is the obvious thing. He never made a speech about it. He just turned the lights on and off at the right times. I did not keep a ledger of sacrifices. I kept a ledger of small proofs. The nick in the banister where a school project taught us what gravity preferred. The divot in the yard where a slip turned into a bruise and a laugh. The sunburnt circle where a kiddie pool lived for one relentless July. The whisper of the front door when it closed the way Frank had wanted it to. The clay bones of our home grew around us until the place knew our names even in the dark. Years folded into themselves. Caleb became a man who could lift heavy things and sometimes mistook lifting for love. He left the gate unlatched more than once, and I pretended the wind was to blame. Luke stayed near even when he did not need me to remind him to wear a coat. He learned that silence can be a gift and that questions can be kinder than answers. When he fixed a loose hinge, he did not announce the repair. He stood still to be sure the room liked the change. If I hold these memories too long, they turn into a weight I cannot carry. So I set them down on the work table of my mind and look at them like tools I will need again. I see Frank's hands dusted with sawdust, the creases turned white by labor. I see the ring he slid off and lost to the footings, the small gold circle warm as breath on my palm before it vanished. Sometimes when thunder walks across the evening, I tell myself that is the sound of his ring still holding. The thought is unreasonable. I have never needed a reason when it comes to love. The needle song in my head softens into a hum. In the present, a machine starts up in the next room, a whir that does not belong to my old singer. Vanessa's washer takes the clean work and turns it into a performance. It throbs and turns and pitches its sound into the hallway as if it were proud of agitation. I let the noise pass through me. I am back at the table with cloth and pins, back at the foundation with mud and line, back at the porch with a boy who believes walls can be hungry. I place my palm against the cool of the counter and feel the faint echo of the day we set that first true line. What was made by two tired people and a stubborn faith does not answer to anyone's careless mouth. What is shaped by hands cannot be erased by names spoken in a raised voice. Outside, a cloud opens and the afternoon breathes rain. The scent slips in under the door, familiar as an old neighbor. I close my eyes, and the ground of the past meets the floor of the present, and I remember why I stayed. The day Vanessa arrived, she scanned my living room as if measuring where her reflection would fit. Her suitcase wheels clicked across the threshold like a metronome, and the mirror above the mantel caught the first glint of her smile. She adjusted a strand of hair and glanced past the couch, the rug, the small table that still remembers glue from school projects. I watched the mirror watch her. It has a habit of telling the truth without making a sound. We carried her boxes in, or rather Caleb carried, and she pointed. "Set that near the window," she said, as if the light itself worked for her. The room held its breath the way rooms do when they are being introduced to someone with plans. I tried to be a good host. There was iced tea sweating into rings on coasters, a plate of cornbread warm enough to let butter melt at its own pace, a bowl of peaches breathing summer. She walked the perimeter the way a buyer walks a house they do not yet own. Fingers skimmed the edge of the mantel. She surveyed the couch pillows and the print of the fabric, the way the sunlight fell into a rectangle on the rug. "It is a charming space," she said in a voice that made charm sound like a problem to be solved. Caleb kissed her cheek as if to stamp approval on everything she had not yet touched. Dinner was roast chicken with rosemary, carrots that had listened to the earth long enough to be sweet, and a salad I cut into pieces small enough for conversation. Vanessa chewed with an economy that made the fork look efficient. She said the seasoning leaned old world. I smiled and asked if that meant too much salt or not enough pepper. She said it meant traditional. She said traditional as if it were a jacket a person should outgrow. Caleb laughed a light laugh and tapped his glass as if to propose a toast to new habits. I ate and let the food do its work. Not every sentence needs an answer. Some just need a napkin. She asked where I bought the drapery and whether the fabric came in other tones. She said a linen panel would invite better light. I told her those panels had seen more sunrises than her marriage and preferred to be addressed with gratitude. She blinked, then smiled the way a person smiles in a meeting when they are making a note to circle back and win later. Caleb looked at his plate as if dinner had surprised him by being complicated. Luke called that night to say he would drop off a bag of fresh coffee on Sunday. When he asked how the settling in went, I told him the house would learn new footsteps and we would be patient while it listened. He said he would bring the coffee and a spare set of shelf brackets in case any wall forgot how to hold something steady. His voice steadied mine. I did not mention Vanessa's survey of the room or the way she looked at the mirror like a stage light. In the morning, I found the spice rack reorganized into a neat gradient that pleased a camera more than a cook. Cumin and cinnamon had divorced and now lived in separate corners of an alphabet no one in this kitchen had ever needed. Sugar stepped one shelf higher as if trying on heels. Vanessa called it a workflow. She used the word efficient, as if homes were factories and tenderness a delay. She filmed a quick video of her new system and sent it to someone who replied with 3 hearts and a sparkle. Caleb told her she was brilliant. I reached for salt and found it behind paprika, as if my own hand needed to be trained. At lunch, she held a swatch of pale fabric up to the window and asked me to imagine the view. I said I preferred the view that already exists. She said modern lines would freshen things. I asked whether the scent of bread coming out of the oven needed freshening or if it always worked without a consultant. She laughed, not unkindly, and said I was old-fashioned. She said it like an assessment, not an insult, but the word sat down on the table between us anyway. Caleb smiled that diplomatic smile he uses at work, the one that invites everyone to pretend they agree. He did not correct her, and that silence did more work than any sentence could. The mirror continued to record. I saw her in it again that afternoon, walking past the mantel with a small stack of frames. Family pictures had been moved last week into a drawer no one opens unless they are looking for batteries. Now, 2 new frames leaned against the clock. A beach, a skyline, a couple at a rooftop party under strings of light. The mirror took them in and did not complain. I wiped the glass, and it gave me back my own face with a question I did not answer. We had an early supper. She wanted quinoa. I cooked rice. She wanted salmon. I made chicken soup because the wind had teeth that day, and soups know how to talk to the weather. She tasted and set her spoon down gently and said, "You cook with memory." I told her memory is a spice no bottle can keep. Caleb reached for her hand, and the 2 of them smiled at each other in a way that did not require me to be present. I refilled their glasses and watched the steam rise from the pot like a patient messenger. The messenger did not carry good or bad news, only a reminder that heat becomes nourishment if handled with care. After the dishes, Vanessa walked the hallway and paused at the framed cross-stitch my sister had made 30 years ago. She said the pattern was sweet, and then she said perhaps we could curate a cleaner look. Curate is a useful word when people want to remove something without admitting they are erasing it. I told her that piece is the kind of clean you cannot launder into cotton. She said she understood and smiled. The smile made a note the mirror would remember. Later she stood again beneath the mirror and shifted it 1 inch to the left. An experiment, she said to the room. The room did not answer, but I felt a tilt I did not like. Caleb told her it looked great from the couch. I made tea. He asked if I would like to try a different blend he bought for her. It had a scent like flowers wearing perfume. I said peppermint would do. Peppermint does not compete with truth. We tried a movie. Vanessa prefers films where men run on rooftops and cars argue with physics. I stayed with it for 20 minutes, and then let my eyelids negotiate their own contract. When I woke, the credits rolled and the mirror showed me their 2 faces lit by the blue of a scene they had already forgotten. I stood and stretched and told them I was turning in. Vanessa stood too and pressed a hand to my arm and said she hoped I would be open to small updates, little things to help this place breathe. I told her the place already breathes. The trick is learning to breathe with it. She went to the kitchen and opened the freezer and laughed softly at my habit of storing bread there. She said we could improve traffic in the pantry with clear bins. Caleb offered to order a set that would arrive by Friday. I nodded and placed 1 slice of bread on a plate, not because I was hungry, but because small acts anchor a person when the room is shifting. In the bathroom, a bottle of her cleanser stood where my soap dish used to live. A towel hung with the tag facing out, an offense I let go. On the counter, a small jade roller waited like an accessory to a ritual I do not practice. I placed my brush back in its old spot and left everything else as it had announced itself. There is an element of hospitality that looks like surrender but is not. It is reconnaissance. Night came on that sharp blue the sky wears when it wants to be taken seriously. I checked the back door and gathered the mail and turned off the lamp in the hall. Vanessa's new fabric swatch lay draped over the curtain rod, a pale test of her intention. I touched it with one finger and listened to the faint whisper of its weave. Then I drew the existing fabric closed and heard the familiar rustle I have heard on 1,000 evenings when the day decides to let go. That sound is not loud, but it carries a weight that reminds me who I am when no one else is in the room. I lay in bed and studied the ceiling where hairline lines map seasons better than any calendar. In the distance, muffled, I heard Vanessa's laugh, bright and efficient, and Caleb's softer answer. The house listened and did what houses do when strangers move in. It held everything the way a patient's chest holds breath. On the mantel, the mirror turned the room into itself again and again, and if you looked closely, you could see where her reflection had already staked a claim and where mine had chosen, for now, not to step back. It's not violence that erases you, it's the quiet rearranging of your world while you're not looking. One morning, the chair where you tie your shoes is angled toward the hallway instead of the window. By noon, the key bowl has been replaced with a tray that prefers the sound of bracelets. In the evening, you reach for a calendar and touch a glossy board where someone else writes their plans with pretty pens. Nothing breaks, nothing shatters, and yet something does. I began to chart the changes the way sailors mark currents. The mail that used to rest by the back door now lay stacked in a basket by the entry, as if it had been promoted. The radio station I once woke to traded its old standards for a crisp voice that measured steps and calories. A lemon candle lit itself at dusk, and the kitchen did what rooms do when a new scent tells them who they are supposed to be. It performed. I practiced a new kind of walking, the kind that yields 2 inches here, a glance there, a small apology to no one in particular. In the pantry, the cereal boxes had consulted with the sleek bins and decided to stand in a parade. A glass jar labeled snacks took the space where I used to keep flour in its paper bag, folded just so. It was not wrong. It was not right. It simply asserted itself until the bag had nowhere to sit. The dining table, faithful as ever, took on the job of proving what we were becoming. My seat at the end had a view of the yard and the maple where autumn thinks out loud. That seat slid half a foot, and then a foot again, and a new place setting appeared beside it, then another across from it, a row of napkins folded into points like sails. One evening, a place card with Vanessa written in careful loops leaned against a water glass at the head. Caleb stood back and admired the arrangement the way men admire engines. I stood back and learned to breathe through a different set of ribs. Visitors began to arrive more often. Neighbors I barely knew, colleagues from offices I would never see, women who introduced themselves by the names of their yoga teachers. They crossed the threshold with effortless smiles and a rain of compliments about light and flow and storage. I said welcome. I poured tea. I watched their eyes skim our shelves the way birds scan for branches. They sat where they liked. My hands found tasks that kept me standing. A sliced lemon, a cup refilled, a towel smoothed. On a Friday afternoon, Vanessa announced an evening gathering in the same tone people use to announce spring. She had been busy all week with messages. By dusk, the entry hummed, and shoes lined up like a polite army. Someone tuned a small speaker, and music slid along the hallway and spilled into the living room, where the rug steadied all the new laughter. I held the door for a woman with red nails who said she loved what we had done with the place. I considered telling her what the place had done with me and decided against it. The kitchen became a project. Vanessa had hired a caterer and suggested we keep the workspace clear. She drew a small sign that said private and set it on the hallway door as if a paper card could teach a room to whisper. Then she slid the little brass bolt that Frank installed decades ago when the boys were small and we wanted the dog out while soup simmered. At the other entrance, where the swing door meets the frame, she pressed a rubber wedge tightly. The kettle watched from the stove with its round stare. It seemed silly to feel a lock in the chest when the latch was only metal and memory, and yet there it was. Guests filled the spaces that used to belong to hours of my days. The couch hosted stories from cities that will never know my name. The rug accepted high heels that did not leave mud. A new laugh cast itself onto the ceiling and stuck there like confetti. People asked who curated the art and whether anyone had the recipe for the sparkling punch. No one needed me to answer anything important. An empty chair sat at the table near where I used to sit, pushed back just enough to say someone had thought of me, and then changed their mind. I stood beside it a moment too long and recognized the shape of my absence. Caleb passed by with a tray and a grin that tried to be everything to everyone. He brushed my arm and asked if I was having fun. I told him I was fine, and the word sounded like a napkin folded so precisely it forgets it is cloth. He nodded and kept moving. Vanessa shimmered through the room, accepting compliments on a theme I had not learned. She introduced me once as Eleanor, who keeps this place warm, and the phrase landed like a scented candle on a mantel where family used to live. I stopped being a mother the moment I became a roommate. The thought arrived without ceremony and refused to leave. I tested it against the room. It held. The woman near the window compared apps. The men near the magazine stack debated a game that would never interest me. Someone asked about the mirror, whether it was antique or just pretending. I prepared a plate with olives and stood at the edge of everything I had built and willed my hands not to shake. When the first wave of visitors drifted to the patio for air, I slipped down the hallway as if I were delivering a secret. The private sign tilted in the faint breeze of the vent. The bolt shone like a new coin. I did not touch it. In the reflection of the oven door, I saw my own face and the tired mercy of it. The pantry window showed me the yard in its steady kindness. The maple did its work without applause. Music swelled and receded. I sat for a moment at the far end of the table, where the empty chair waited, and counted to 10 and then to 20. Someone set a glass where my hand used to rest. I stood again because sitting made the room tilt. I took the plates to the trash. I wiped a ring of condensation from the wood and watched the circle disappear under a cloth that did not know it had erased anything at all. Vanessa glided over to tell me everyone was delighted. She asked if I would mind taking a short rest in my room while they finished a surprise for Caleb. She said the hallway would stay clear that way. Her voice carried the courtesy of someone directing traffic, not cruelty, and yet I felt the nudge like a palm between my shoulder blades. I told her I needed a breath and stepped onto the porch where evening was beginning its slow work. Out there, the air was not curated. The street carried the soft complaint of a passing truck. A neighbor's dog announced a squirrel with great sincerity. The porch boards remembered how my sons had once lined up toy soldiers and argued quietly about battles they did not understand. I sat on the top step and rested my palms on the wood and let the grain tell me a story that had nothing to do with playlists and party themes. When I went back in, the surprise was underway. A toast, a speech. Caleb lifted his glass and thanked everyone for welcoming a new chapter. People tapped their rims and smiled at the tidy arc of it. The chair near mine remained empty until a woman in green asked if it was taken, and then settled without waiting for an answer. I stood beside the doorway and clapped at the right places, and felt each sound pass through me as if I were made of gauze. As the night thinned, I collected stray cups and straightened a stack of plates because straightening is a language hands speak when mouths are tired. The bolt on the hallway door was still engaged. The wedge still leaned at attention. I did not argue with hardware. I turned off the porch light. I folded a throw across the couch where perfume lingered. People said goodnight with the bright tone of those who have been well fed and well seen. The door shut softly behind the last goodbye, and the music sank into a faint hum and then into nothing. The quiet that followed was not the restful kind, it was the kind that counts. Tick. The clock in the hall made a small insistence I could feel in my teeth. Tick. I stood in the dining room and looked at the table that had always known how to hold what we brought to it. One chair stood a little apart, as if it had been rearranged and forgotten. I set it back where it belonged and ran my palm over the wood until the grain agreed with me. The clock kept going the way clocks do when people cannot. Tick. The house did not ask what I had learned. It already knew. People do not lose a home in one night. They lose it corner by corner, chair by chair, until one evening they find themselves clapping politely for a toast that does not include their name, and the room claps back with hands that are not theirs. On my 67th birthday, they handed me a menu instead of a cake. We were at a diner off the highway, where the neon sign buzzed with one letter out, and the vinyl seats remembered 1,000 tired nights. The hostess set 3 laminated cards in front of us and said, "Enjoy as if it were a spell that could turn lukewarm coffee into a celebration." I ran my palm over the table and felt the faint stick of old sugar. Caleb slid into the booth beside Vanessa, and I took the edge near the aisle where people brushed past with coats that smelled like gasoline and rain. A television in the corner remarked on the weather none of us planned to stand in. Somewhere, a birthday banner drooped from last month, the string curled like a shrug. The server asked if we were celebrating anything. Caleb said a small family dinner. Keep it simple. She offered a slice of pie on the house with a candle. Vanessa smiled and said, maybe not tonight. She said prices at these places have gone through the roof, and desserts are where they get you. Caleb nodded and said she was right, we should be wise. The server moved on with the soft apology of someone who has learned to save people from their own joy. I read the menu like a stranger trying to learn a language from a tourist pamphlet. Melt, patty, deluxe, combo. The food photographs wore a shine that light cannot make. Caleb suggested we split a salad so we could order an entree without feeling heavy. Vanessa traced the cost column with her finger and chose something that sounded like dinner if you said the words fast. She told me we would do something bigger next year. I said next year I might not be here. I did not say it to punish. I said it the way a person says the weather is changing. The sentence landed and sat there. Caleb cleared his throat and said I would outlive them both. Vanessa laughed, a gentle laugh, and told me not to be dramatic. The laugh was polite. Politeness is a bow you tie when you do not intend to open a gift. The food arrived in plates that sweated along the rims. Caleb's fries were hot at the tips and cold at the heart. My soup wore a skin that slid back when I stirred. Vanessa tasted and said the seasoning leaned toward yesterday and asked for extra lemon because lemon is the theater of freshness. We spoke about work and shoes and a movie they planned to see. I watched the parking lot through the window and counted taillights like candles someone forgot to light. The buzzing sign over the door went bright, then dull, then bright again, the electrical version of trying. I remembered other birthdays without meaning to. Frank was holding a lopsided cake at the threshold because the boys had hidden in the pantry to jump out, but could not agree on when. Luke insisted I close my eyes, then told me to open them early so he could see my face in the exact moment surprise begins. Caleb presented me with a potholder he had stitched into a map, every road a crooked line that led back to our front door. That memory pressed against the diner glass and fogged it from the inside. The server returned with 3 waters and a small tea light in a cloudy jar. She set it near my hand and patted her apron for a lighter. The lighter was empty. She tried again and then smiled that worn smile of people who run out of flame and time. She said she would be right back and was gone long enough for the jar to become a little moon without a sky. Vanessa said we should not make a fuss. She said a birthday is still a birthday without fire. Caleb squeezed my wrist and said we could celebrate properly when the schedule loosened. Schedules do not loosen, people do. We ate. The television chattered. A boy at the counter blew out his candle, and his friends cheered so loudly that even the cook turned his head. My jar remained ajar. The unlit wick stood like a thin idea in cloudy wax. I would have paid cash to hear breath against flame. I would have settled for the small scratch of a match. Not for the spectacle of it, but for the moment, right before light, when everyone leans in and waits together. Together is what makes a room warm. Not heat, not electricity. People. Caleb asked if I wanted coffee. He said their refills were free. I said yes because free still feels like kindness even when it is a strategy. The cup arrived, almost hot. I wrapped both hands around it and let the steam give me a task. Vanessa inspected the bill when it came and circled an item with her fingernail. She told the server a charge had been added by mistake. The server apologized and removed the cost of something we had already eaten. Vanessa handed the leather folder to Caleb and said, "See, it pays to pay attention." He said it always does. I swallowed the coffee and thought about the things that cost you even when they are removed from a page. On the way out, a teenager in a paper hat called happy birthday toward my shoulder. I said thank you to the night because he did not look up. The door breathed out warmth and took in rain. The parking lot had turned from black to mirror. Vanessa hurried across the wet with her coat lifted at the collar. Caleb put a hand on her back. The car coughed, woke, and the radio delivered a chorus that did not know where we had been. We drove home inside a bubble of wipers. Vanessa scrolled through messages and said a friend had found a sale on bar stools we might love. Caleb asked what color would go with the new palette, and she said something light that flatters skin. I watched the road and the white line that tells tired people where to keep their cars and their sorrow. We pulled into the driveway, and the porch light, the one Luke fixed last winter, nudged the dark aside. Inside, the house smelled like rain and detergent. The kitchen was tidy, the way rooms are tidy when they are not allowed to be anything else. Caleb kissed my cheek at the doorway to the hall and said, "Thank you for dinner." The thank you was backward in a way I could not quite untangle. Vanessa set the leftover box in the fridge and said, "Next year we will throw a proper party." I said, "I hope next year you still know my name." She told me to get some rest so I would feel better in the morning. I nodded and folded my coat and placed it where it had always lived. She looked at the hook and then at me and then at the hallway without speaking. They went to their room with the soft bustle of people who do not want to wake the part of the house that remembers. I stood at the counter and opened the junk drawer where rubber bands and nails and a pencil stub keep their little conference. At the back lay a small box of candles, the birthday kind with stripes that make children grin. One candle remained. I set it on the counter beside the unlit jar we had carried home without admitting we had taken it. The jar was cloudy even under our kitchen light. The wick leaned toward my hand as if asking. I reached for the matches. I found none. I could have gone to the store. I did not. There is a dignity in not begging the world for fire. The window rattled in a gust, a soft rattle like a polite disagreement. I pressed 2 fingers to the glass and felt the outside argue against my skin. The house settled around me, a quiet old animal that has learned how to sleep through storms. I slid the little candle back into its box and closed the drawer with the palm of my hand. The sound it made was small and final. Somewhere down the hall, water ran and stopped. A door clicked. A laugh fluttered and fell. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark long enough for the room to find its shape again. My eyes adjusted. The chairs became themselves. The table breathed. The unlit jar held still on the counter, a clear reminder that warmth is not promised. It must be given. It must be guarded. People like to say age makes a person cold. They are wrong. Cold begins when the world forgets to light a single candle and calls it saving money. The wind pressed once at the window and moved on. I let it. I walked to my room and lay down and listened to the house remember, and the remembering kept me warm in a way soup and neon never could. All I said was, "Don't move my plants," and somehow that made me the villain. It began with a scrape on tile and a ribbon of soil looping behind a terracotta pot as Vanessa dragged it toward the shadowed corner she wanted for a bar cart. The green leaves trembled like a hand held too long in the air. A clump of roots tore free and sat there on the floor like a small heart surprised to be outside a body. She said the windowsill would look cleaner without clutter. She said the furniture needed breathing room. I said those pots lived there for a reason: light, habit, memory. She smiled and reached for another, her bracelet chiming against the rim. Caleb looked up from his phone and asked if we could not make a scene before lunch. His voice had the patience of a man embarrassed by a mother, in front of a wife. I stepped between the sill and her hands, not fast, not dramatic, the way a person moves to catch a glass before it rolls off a counter. Vanessa paused, then tipped her head as if I were a recipe she was still deciding whether to keep. She said I was attached to old arrangements. I said arrangements become roots when you live with them long enough. Caleb sighed the sigh of a man who would rather buy an answer than build one. He told me this is her house now, too. The sentence hit the tile and slid. Not our home. Not the place with a scar on the baseboard and a kiss of sunlight at 10 in the morning. Her house. The words were not loud, but they carried weight. I felt the floor tilt under me by a degree only I could feel. I thought of the ring poured into the footings and how it has held more than concrete all these years. I lifted the pot with both hands and set it back where the sill knows its shape. Soil crumbled down my wrist. I brushed it away and kept my voice level. Roots matter, Caleb. Even flowers know that. He opened his mouth to answer and could not find a reply that sounded both firm and kind. Vanessa filled the pause with a little laugh that did not warm the room. Then maybe you should grow somewhere else. Silence stepped in like weather. The refrigerator hummed with a stubborn calm. A truck outside shifted gears. In the sink, a drip counted something I could not pay. The smell of damp soil rose and threaded itself through the kitchen, honest and old. I reached for a glass and filled it at the tap, the way I have done 1,000 times under all kinds of skies. The water hit the bottom too hard, and the thin lip answered with a hairline sound. A small crack spoke without asking permission. Caleb flinched. He said I was being difficult for the sake of it. He said Vanessa was trying to improve the space. He said I knew change made him tense, and I should be the one to model grace. His words piled up and waited for my temper to show its face so he could be relieved. I did not give him that relief. I placed the glass on the counter and watched the ring of water spread and fade. Vanessa stepped to the sill and slid a fingertip under a leaf as if to check for dust. She said the greenery would be happier in a corner if we added a tall lamp. She said she knew a trick for making anything thrive anywhere. I told her the trick is respect. She smiled as if she recognized the word from a book and moved on. In the mirror above the mantel, I watched the three of us stand in a triangle a little too sharp. Caleb's jaw worked. He reached for one pot, and I let him lift it because I am done wrestling people for things that can be put down. He set it on the counter near the stove. Soil made a crescent on the metal. He told me the kitchen is already different, and the sooner I accept that, the better. He said we might as well get used to calling this what it is, her house. He said it again to hear how it sounded when he owned it. The second time, it did not wobble. I folded the dish towel, unfolded it, then folded it again. My palms needed a task so they would not betray me. Vanessa wandered to the pantry and praised her clear bins with the certain voice of a woman who prefers to see through solutions. She said my system had been sweet and chaotic. Caleb nodded and watched her with the expression of a man who thinks admiration is love and love is agreement. I felt a quiet thing rise and stand beside me. It did not push. It took my hand. I looked at the spill of roots and leaves and saw Frank teaching the boys how to repot something without hurting it. He had a way of cupping the soil like a bowl and telling the plant the move would not break its heart. I looked at the cracked glass and thought of last night's unlit candle and the week of rearranged corners and the month that has unthreaded itself one fiber at a time. I thought about what a person owes her own spine. Caleb told me to stop making the kitchen a battlefield. He said we could compromise and put 2 pots in the corner and leave one where I wanted if I promised not to get upset when the lamp arrived. I said compromise is not what you call it when one person keeps what matters and the other is offered a souvenir. He breathed out hard through his nose. The sound was an animal trying not to bare its teeth. Vanessa set her phone on the counter and leaned in. She said she understands I have a history with this room. She said she is trying to make it modern. She said if I cannot learn to adapt, perhaps we can think about a little studio nearby. She said it lightly, like a shopping tip. Caleb stared at the tile for a long second. He did not tell her to stop. He did not say no. He did not say, "Not my mother." I did not raise my voice. I did not list what my hands have built on these surfaces. I did not call anyone ungrateful. I let the heat pass through me the way steam passes a window and forgets it touched glass. I told Vanessa I heard her. I told Caleb I would not argue. I told both of them I would make sure the room finally learns who it belongs to. My tone was even enough that they missed the hinge when it swung. Vanessa returned to arranging a tray. Caleb picked up the broom and gathered the dirt and tossed it with a flick meant to look practical. When the last bit slid into the dustpan, he straightened and asked if we were good now. I said we were done for today. He gave me a look that asked if I meant peace. I let him believe whatever would get him through lunch. I took the cracked glass to the trash and felt the faint line along my thumb where the rim had spoken. In the hallway, the clock kept its steady counsel. I stepped outside to the porch and let the air cool my face. The maple whispered in a language older than interior design. A neighbor drove by and lifted 2 fingers in a wave that belonged to other decades. I breathed until the tremor left my hands. Then I went back inside and wiped the sill with care I would not waste on people who mistake calm for weakness. Vanessa announced a grocery list and asked if we needed anything essential. I said I would pick up a few things. Caleb took the keys and offered to come along. I told him to stay and finish his lamp plans. He accepted the permission like a gift he had earned. I walked to the car and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The silence in that little space felt like a chapel. I placed my hands at 10 and 2 and watched the porch through the windshield. Inside, their shadows crossed the kitchen as they measured and imagined. In the corner of the window, the reflection of the sill looked empty, then full, then empty again, the way water looks like glass until it decides to be a river. Somewhere in the house, the phone rang and stopped. A leaf on the porch step turned over and showed its pale side like a quiet answer. I thought of keys and metal and the small sound a door makes when it decides who is welcome. Roots matter, I whispered to the steering wheel. Even flowers know that. The words landed not as a plea but as a plan. When people treat patience as softness, silence becomes a blade that does not draw blood. It simply cuts a clean line. I turned the ignition, listened to the engine catch, and drove toward the place where hard choices are made quietly and paid for in cash. That Friday night I didn't slam the door. I simply rewrote who held the keys. The calendar page said it was the end of the week, but the rooms had already ended something earlier. Caleb and Vanessa dressed for a late dinner, the kind that requires a reservation and a story. She floated perfume through the hallway, and he checked his reflection in the mantel mirror while pretending not to. I set a plate in the sink and listened to the evening warm its hands. When their car pulled away, the house exhaled. The porch light held steady like a small, brave star. I stood in the kitchen with my palm on the counter and felt the grain answer back. Then I reached for the phone and called Luke. He picked up before the second ring. His voice made the room remember itself. "Tell me what happened," he said. I told him enough for a son to know, not enough to make a brother an enemy. He listened without rushing me toward a conclusion. He has always had that gift, the kind that lays a clean cloth on a table and waits. "You have done everything for him, Mom. Maybe it is time you do something for yourself." The words landed not like a shove, but like a hand at the small of my back when a step is too high. I breathed and then told him I would be fine. He offered to come over. I said no. He knew better than to argue with a tone I learned from Winter. I looked up a number I never thought I would need. A man answered with a name that sounded older than the tools in his van. I told him what I needed changed, and he said he could be there within the hour. He did not ask for reasons. He asked if I had proof that the place was mine. I told him I had more than paper, but paper would do. He chuckled in a way that made me picture a hat on a peg by a door that always opens. Headlights rolled into the drive and rested like two quiet eyes. He stepped out carrying a canvas bag that had seen rain and sun and a dozen porches. Stainless tools clicked together inside like a private language. He was the type of man who says good evening to a threshold and means it. His hair had the silver of a road that knows where it has been. He looked at the front door hardware, then at the back, then at the side entrance by the laundry, and nodded to himself as if the house had told him its history. We stood at the table while I opened a folder. He read the name on the deed and returned the document with 2 fingers on the corner, careful not to smudge the past. He asked about the number of existing keys in circulation. I told him enough to make him frown gently. He set the bag down, and the metal inside shifted with a soft chorus. He worked with a kind of respect I have only seen in people who fix things for a living. He removed the old cylinder and placed it on a cloth as if it could bruise. Tiny pins lay in a row like grains of bright rice. A headlamp threw a pool of light around his hands. The glow caught the fine dust of brass and made it look like daylight had broken into glitter. Screws turned, the plate aligned, the mechanism listened, and then agreed to cooperate. The steady bite of a screwdriver steadied me too. He asked about the boy and the woman without using their names. I said I had 2 sons and 1 daughter-in-law who likes to arrange the world until it forgets it knows me. He nodded, as if he had stood in that sentence before. "It is not revenge, ma'am. It is reclaiming space." He said it like a man explaining the weather, not moral, not dramatic, just true. The words found the floor and rooted there. I felt the quiet in my chest shift into something with a spine. He finished at the front first. The knob turned with a new confidence, not stiff, not eager, just sure. He checked the back entry next, the latch settling into its pocket with a clean little click that sounded like the end of a thought. At the side door, he adjusted the strike by the width of a coin until it agreed to mate without complaint. He never forced anything. He invited alignment and waited until metal decided to be reasonable. I followed him to the van and watched him cut fresh brass to the pattern he had made. The machine whirred and sang a single note. Shavings gathered in a small shining hill. He brushed them into his palm and tipped them into a jar that once held jam. Waste becomes memory in the hands of certain men. He handed me 3 new keys. They lay warm on my skin as if they had a pulse. 1 for now, 1 for safe, 1 for the person who remembers how to show up without being asked. Luke will have that one. I slid it into my pocket and felt the weight remind me who I am. He named a price that belonged to a world where labor still counts. I paid in cash, a stack of bills smoothed with the edge of my thumb. He did not count them twice. He tucked them into the canvas bag and then did something that unknotted a place in my throat. He stood still and asked if I wanted him to wait while I tried each door. I said yes. I wanted a witness. We went together, as if walking a perimeter. At the front, I turned the key and heard the small sound new hardware makes when it learns your hand. At the back, I set the guard and released it again. In the laundry entry, I tested the handle with the gentle insistence I use when checking on sleeping children. Everything answered. The house made a series of tiny agreements. When we returned to the kitchen, he glanced at the mantel mirror and then at me. He said he sees this more lately. People my age, he said, who built rooms that raised men who forget. He shook his head in a way that scolded fate, not people. Then he lifted his bag, tipped the brim of a hat that no longer sat there, and wished the place a good night. The van backed into the dark with caution, and I admired it. Its red lights washed the porch boards for a moment and then withdrew. I locked the front door once and then again, not from fear, but because ritual makes the body believe what the mind has chosen. The new key turned smoothly. The door answered with that clean click, and the sound walked through the house like a messenger delivering identical letters. Each room read its name and was shaded. I called Luke and told him it was done. He asked if I was steady. I told him I was a keel. He laughed the kind of laugh that fixes a person without touching them. He said he would come by in the morning with bagels and the good coffee. I told him to bring himself and the mug he likes. We said goodnight without saying goodbye. He has always understood the difference. I gathered the old keys from drawers and bowls and pockets where they had nested. I set them in the sink, not to drown them, just to keep them from wandering. I held one to the light and saw fingerprints like ghosts. I dried my hands on a towel and placed the newest key in a small tin that once held sewing needles. The lid clicked, soft and certain. The metal was cool and honest. The lamp beside the window cast a warm circle on the counter, and the brass winked in it like a promise made without theater. I walked the hallway and let my knuckles brush the painted wall the way you pat a shoulder after a long talk. The rooms were still. The clock kept patient time. Through the front window, the street lamp drew a pale coin on the edge of the porch and pressed its light against the glass the way a child presses a face to a bakery case. I stood in that glow and felt my own face settle into an expression I recognized. Not triumph, not bitterness, relief with thinking in it. At the door, I turned the key once more, not because I doubted, but because it pleased me. The mechanism answered with a tidy sound, and the echo trembled across the floorboards to places with names no one else remembers. Respect sometimes needs to be fastened before it can open without fear. Tonight I fastened it. Tomorrow, if anyone asks where home begins, I will let the metal speak for me. I stepped onto the porch, and the night took my shoulders without asking for anything. The air had a hint of rain, and the street was quiet as a prayer said under the breath. I stood long enough to feel the boards remember my weight. When I went back in, I closed the door with a gentle hand. The latch found its seat and rested there. Outside, the streetlight kept watch. Inside, the rooms uncoiled. I breathed with them until the silence felt like mine again. They knocked for half an hour. I listened for half a lifetime. The first sound was the scrape of gravel as their car rolled in too fast, then doors thudding, then footsteps that remembered where the porch boards creaked. Keys rattled. Metal kissed metal and found nothing to love. The knob turned, hopeful, then stalled. Silence. Another try. A sharper twist. The new heart of the door did not answer. The first fist met wood with confidence, the way a son believes his mother will always make room. The second was smaller, a polite tapping layered over the heavier sound, as if courtesy could unlock brass. I sat in the dark with my hands folded and counted each contact the way you count breaths when a wave rolls over your head. The house counted on me. The frames on the wall did not move. The clock kept time for itself. Faces have a way of showing through sound. I could hear Caleb before I saw him, the cadence he learned at 10 when he lied about homework and tried to sound certain. The rhythm he used at 15 when he came home late from a game and needed me to forgive what he had not yet admitted. Vanessa stood near him. Even through the door, her presence had a shine. She would be the one to touch the bell with 2 fingers, so it would chime gently. She would be the one to suggest a message or a hotel. She would turn her face toward the night and ask it to be reasonable. A long pause arrived. Gravel whispered under shoes. A key scraped at a seam, then another, the chorus of a pocket full of maybes. The handle bounced as if surprised by its own refusal. The deadbolt answered with quiet certainty. I felt a shiver in my wrists and breathed until it let me go. He once knocked like this when he forgot his keys at 15. He stood outside with a backpack heavy with papers and pride, and I opened before the second tap. He dropped his head on my shoulder and said nothing. I let that memory rise and settle. I opened them. I did not tonight. The air on the other side grew colder. The porch light made a pale island around their feet. A car passed on the street and dragged a ribbon of sound behind it. Somewhere, a dog announced a different story and then lost interest. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, steady as an organ in a church that has stopped believing but keeps the music for company. I could have called out through the woods. I could have explained that paper and metal and memory were on my side. I could have said, "Go sleep, and we will speak in the morning when the sun remembers our names." I chose not to spend any words. People mistake silence for nothing. They are wrong. Silence is a choice with a spine. The rhythm changed from pounding to pleading without language. The bell chimed and rested, chimed and rested. My name lived in the spaces where sound gave up. I laid my palm on the wall beside the door and felt the vibration of what used to be boyhood. The wall held steady as if to say we have carried worse. The noise found a pattern that made my chest ache. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. It was the echo of earlier years when Frank and I set footings, and he struck a form with the flat of his hand to coax it into truth. That gentle thud, that measured insistence. On those mornings the ground answered and we kept building. Tonight, the door answered, and we kept holding. I sat on the bottom stair and tried not to assign meaning to each sound. The stair knew me. It remembered my weight, and offered its own in return. I imagined the porch boards under his shoes, how they would feel his shifting and keep his secret. I imagined Vanessa hugging her coat to her chest and arranging her face into something softer for the sake of the story she would tell later. We tried. We were cold. She would be kind to herself in the telling. I did not need to edit her script. The bell rang twice in quick succession, panic breaking through the choreography. I closed my eyes and pictured the creek that once threatened the edge of our yard. That night, we dug a channel and let the water go by without taking anything important. This was like that. A surge, a force, a choice to hold the line. Minutes turned into something without a name. Half an hour is a small thing until you measure it with a mother's ache. I thought of Luke sleeping, his alarm set, his hands ready to carry bagels and coffee in the morning. I let that image warm me where the night wanted to take heat. I thought of Frank's ring somewhere inside the bones of the threshold, the metal he wore promises with. The circle is no longer on a finger, but is still in service. The idea felt unreasonable. I believed it anyway. The knocking grew tired. The bell gave up first, then the keys, then the fists. Murmurs slipped under the door and evaporated. A heavy exhale fogged the glass in the small pane and left a fading oval. I stood to wipe it out of habit and forced myself to sit again. They stood a while longer, and then the gravel spoke of retreat. Doors shut. The engine stitched itself into the dark and pulled away. Relief arrived like a coat placed on my shoulders. Loss arrived at the same time and asked to share the collar. I let them both in. The house sighed a little, the way rooms do when a guest leaves before midnight. I climbed the stairs, each step careful, as if the quiet might bruise. In bed, I kept my eyes open until the ceiling learned my outline. Somewhere past 1, the world turned its face to the other side of the pillow. I slept without falling all the way in. Before dawn, the birds began their small testing of light. One note, then another. The sky at the edge of the maple traded its black for a softer color that does not have a name in any catalog. I went to the front room and stood where I could see the porch without being seen. The boards held a scatter of leaves that had turned over in a night gust. The mat lay straight. The deadbolt waited, patient as a doorman who has learned to read intention. On the sill, the 2 pots drank early light. Their leaves did not point toward any corner. They did not petition the lamp that had not arrived. They simply reached. I touched one with a fingertip and felt the cool of a morning that wanted to be forgiven for last night. Not yet. I told it without speaking. Not yet. A neighborhood car coughed awake. Somewhere a kettle began that first thin note before a boil. I backed away from the window and stood in the center of the room where sound balances. The silence inside me loosened like a muscle after a long climb. It did not vanish. It changed. I could live with that. There is a story people tell about boundaries. They tell it as if they are fences you build once. I know better. Boundaries are held the way you hold a sleeping child. Not tight, not loose, just sure. Last night I held one. The cost is the bruise you do not show anyone, and the warmth you earn back by degrees. I made coffee in my oldest mug, the one with a tiny chip on the rim, where mornings have taught me how to drink around loss. Steam rose and did not perform. I carried the cup to the hallway and stood where footsteps once ran to meet me after school. I listened for tires in the driveway and heard none. I listened for an apology and heard birds. That was enough for a morning that needed mercy. He once knocked like this at 15, and I opened without thinking. Last night, I let the lesson stand in the doorway in my place. Love is not always a hand on a latch. Sometimes it is a hand that does not move. Sometimes it is the refusal that forces a grown man to learn what keys cannot do when the room no longer answers to his forgetting. The light climbed the wall to the spot where summer keeps its secrets. I took a breath that reached all the way down. I set the mug on the table, and the ring it left looked like a sunrise taking inventory. The day had arrived without asking permission. The house drew itself up and waited for the next right thing. Outside, a bird corrected a note and tried again. Inside, I did the same. She walked in with perfume and pity and left with silence. I knew what she would bring before she crossed the threshold. A soft smile sharpened for persuasion, a posture that practices winning. Green heels that treated the porch as a runway. I opened the door anyway and stepped aside. The afternoon had the color of old honey, and the room kept its own counsel. She introduced herself as Vanessa's relative and called me Eleanor in the tone you use with people you plan to correct. She glanced around as if the walls might join her side. The mantel mirror caught her profile and held it like a photograph. On the low table, a glass vase held carnations that had given up by inches. Their stems bent with the small sorrow of things that were once fresh, and then not. She began with worry. Caleb is stressed. Vanessa is exhausted. Nights in borrowed rooms are cruel. You could end this with one kind gesture. She let that hang between us like a ribbon waiting for applause. I said, please sit. She sat without thanking the chair. She said doors are for family. She said locks tell the wrong story. She said I was hurting people I should love more than dignity. I told her I do love them, and that is why I have drawn a line they can see even in the dark. She smiled and set her handbag beside the wilted blooms. The bag looked expensive. The flowers did not. Then the game began. She said I am old-fashioned and controlling. She said I never wanted another woman close to my son. She said this is jealousy dressed up as principle. She managed all of that while studying her manicure. She is a person who admires her own hands while accusing other people of grasping. I answered slowly so the words would not run ahead of the truth. There is a difference between wanting a seat at the table and taking the table. There is a difference between guiding a son and owning a man. I told her I wanted the first of both, and Vanessa wanted the second. That is not romance, that is acquisition. She sharpened. You are destroying your family over pride. She said it with the confidence of someone who thinks the sentence ends the conversation. No, dear. Pride builds walls. Regard keeps them standing. The carnations bowed their small heads as if they understood. She tried another angle. Tenancy. Rights. The language of leverage is spoken like perfume. I let her finish because people like to hear their power out loud. Then I set the deed on the table where the afternoon lit the ink. Names matter. History matters. But paper is not my only ground. I told her that doors are not weapons, they are sentences. Mine currently says that whoever enters is someone who knows how to keep a room kind. She leaned back and gave me a look meant to measure my softness. She said Vanessa has cried every night. She said Caleb is losing weight. She said I would regret this when the holidays come and my table is empty. I let the words pass through me and out the other side. Pain is not a strategy I will hire. If there is regret at my table, it will sit in my chair and eat with me and tell me what I learned. It will not chase me down the hall. She shifted to charm. You are so strong, so resilient. Why not take the high road? Why not show generosity? I told her that generosity without boundaries is a sale at the expense of the soul. I have already given what most mothers give, and quite a bit more. I will not give myself and call it gracious. The mirror watched us. In it, I saw her examine her reflection and smooth a strand that did not need smoothing. I saw the room hold its breath and decide not to faint. I reached for the vase and lifted one carnation. The stem bent without snapping. That is what happens when water is wrong for too long. The head droops. Color still shows in the petals, but the structure does not support it. I set it back and looked at her. That is what a house becomes without decency. Pretty for a while, then it bows. She lost patience and let the sugar burn. Your son chose his wife. You need to accept it. I said I have accepted it. I will also accept apologies when they arrive with specifics instead of glitter. She tried to object. I raised a hand, and the gesture surprised even me with how little effort it took to find quiet. I said Caleb is welcome when he speaks to me as a son and not a guard. Vanessa is welcome when she speaks to me as kin and not a buyer. Until then, my threshold will make the choices none of us are brave enough to make out loud. She drew herself up to full height on those green heels. She mapped our life with the words modern and outdated. She said gracious people do not count offenses. Gracious people forgive and open doors. I told her I have forgiven many things, and I am the one who opened this door today. The difference between us is simple. You open doors to win. I open them to speak plainly, and then I close them when the conversation is done. Her mouth tightened. She tried the old story again. Jealousy, possessiveness. I met her eyes so she would see I was not aiming for triumph. I told her yes, I have felt jealous of time, not of youth, not of beauty. Of Saturday mornings that used to belong to coffee and small talk and now belong to someone else's preferences. Feeling that does not make me a villain. It makes me a mother. But jealousy is not the engine here. The engine is a standard. It is simple. No one dismantles a woman in her own kitchen and calls it love. She blinked. The set lines around her mouth lost their plan. For a moment I saw the woman under the performance. A sister who has spent years cleaning up the messes left by charm. A tired person who only knows how to push harder. She put a palm on the table as if to anchor herself, and the handbag slid and bumped the vase. Water lapped the rim and stopped. The flowers did not mind. They had already learned to endure. She gathered what was left of her strategy and offered a trade. Return the keys, and we will promise to try harder. We will keep the peace. We will be quiet. I told her peace is not quiet. Peace is an agreement kept without supervision. If they want entry, they will bring new words and prove them with small behavior. She asked what proof could satisfy me. I said, please do not ask me to write your apology for you. Let your conscience do its own work. The afternoon shifted. Light moved a hand's width along the mantel. The mirror was filled with a golden stripe that cut our reflections in half. The top of her face remained polished. The lower half trembled. She looked at the carnations and then away, the way people look away from the truth when it is polite enough to sit in a vase. She stood. She thanked me for my time using a voice that did not want to be in the same sentence as gratitude. She walked to the door, and I walked with her. At the threshold, she turned and tried one last arrow. Families break over lines like this. You can still be the person who rescues yours. I told her I am rescuing it. I am salvaging what can be saved from a fire that pretends it is candlelight. I opened the door, and a narrow wind moved down the hallway, as if the day itself wanted out. She stepped onto the porch, and the green heels clicked a small farewell against the boards that remembered better manners. The door rested against my palm before it met the frame. I closed it gently, and the latch made a sound that felt like a page turning. In the quiet that followed, I heard the house breathe. The hallway held the aftertaste of her perfume, and then traded it for air. A draft worked its way past the baseboard, and then changed its mind. The late sun reached across the room and laid a long bar of warmth on the mirror. In that strip of light, my face looked older and truer. The carnations leaned but did not fall. I tipped a little water from the glass and gave them more of what they needed and less of what they had been offered. When reason takes the seat that tears often claim, justice wears the shape of calm. I stood in that shape until my shoulders understood it. Then I lifted the deed from the table, placed it back in the folder, and slid it into the drawer where old promises go to rest after they have been honored. Outside, the wind considered another pass down the hall and decided against it. Inside, the light moved across the mantel and made a small bright square that found its way into the mirror and stayed. At sunrise, my coffee did not taste like revenge. It tasted like peace. The light came in low and forgiving and touched the edge of the counter as if asking permission. Steam lifted and kept its promise without showing off. Outside, the maple breathed a quiet that most people miss. Inside, the room stood with me the way old friends do when words are not required. The phone did not ring. No messages threaded themselves across the morning, only the soft chorus of a place returning to itself. I watered the 2 pots on the sill, and the soil drank without complaint. On one stem, a new tip showed itself, the size of a thumbnail. I pressed a fingertip near the root line and felt the cool certainty of life that refuses to argue. By late morning, tires found the driveway with patience instead of speed. A door clicked, then another. No rattling of metal, no hurried knocking meant to summon history as proof. The bell chimed once like a question. I set my mug down and let the porcelain mark the table with a faint ring that looked like a tiny sundae. Then I went to the entry and opened the door. Caleb stood with his shoulders lowered in a way that made a mother want to lift them and then decide not to. He had shaved but missed a narrow strip beneath the jaw, as if distraction had won that inch. Vanessa stood half a step behind him with no paint on her face, and a bouquet of grocery store flowers held like a homework assignment she meant to get right this time. The wind walked past us and then decided to wait outside. Caleb spoke first, not the speech of a man defending a situation, the sound of a son who found his own weight. He said he had been wrong to raise his voice. He said he had been trying to fix his embarrassment with volume. He said he had forgotten how to measure what mattered. Each sentence stood up on its own legs and did not ask me to hold it steady. I listened and felt something uncoil. Vanessa's turn arrived, and she did not decorate it. She said she had treated the rooms like they were props and me like an obstacle to a picture she was staging. She named the moments without hiding them under softer linens. The photos were removed, the kitchen was rearranged, the careless sentence about a studio. The night, she was content to let me become a problem. Her voice shook once and then found even ground. She said there was a reason she could not admit before. She had been jealous. Not of my age or my place at the head of the table. Jealous of how Caleb spoke about his mother to anyone who would listen. He told stories about patching roofs and sewing at midnight and digging channels for floodwater. He told them with the kind of respect that made her afraid she would never be chosen in the same way. She tried to cure the fear by controlling the scene. Fear does not cure under control, it multiplies. I let the quiet sit between us long enough to mean something. Then I stepped back and waved them in. We went to the kitchen because there is no truer room for hard truths. They sat at the table and placed the flowers down without asking where they belonged. The vase on the sideboard waited and did not push. I told them what I needed if this place was going to be a home again, not a list dressed for company. Simple things that do not require a lawyer to hold. If something changes in these rooms, we talk first and we listen all the way through. When hurt happens, it gets named by the one who felt it, and the other person does not tell them it is a misunderstanding. If voices rise, we pause and try again when no one is busy trying to win. The person who lives longest with the consequences has the final word and carries it with grace. And there will be only one second chance. If it fails, we part without fire. Caleb nodded with his whole face. Vanessa asked how she would prove she understood. I told her the proof is small and daily. Paper towels are restocked before I notice they are low. Spices return to the shelf where a cook's hand can find them in the dark. Family photos spread back across the refrigerator with new pictures that include her because membership is not a vote you win once. Luke greeted without being asked when he visits, not because he is required, but because decency is contagious when we let it be. The kettle began its thin song and I set it off the flame to give the moment space. I told Vanessa something I had not said out loud even to myself. A home is not about who owns it. It is about who keeps it kind. She looked at the sill where the new tip was emerging, then back at me. Her answer was soft but held. Then let us keep it kind together. We stood and moved like people who remember how to be careful. She lifted the flowers, and I found the vase, and we changed the water and cut the stems at an angle, the way my sister taught me when both of us were younger, and believed every bouquet could be persuaded to last. Caleb took the old blossoms from the trash and tied them with twine to carry to the compost, as if even what is finished deserves to be seen out properly. He passed behind my chair and let his hand brush my shoulder in a way that said thank you, without the awkwardness of the word. The sun crossed the floor slowly and found the scar near the baseboard from the toy truck that once took a corner too fast. Vanessa saw it and smiled like a person meeting a family legend. She asked about the road the truck imagined. I told her it was a race to a finish line made of spoons. She laughed, and it sounded like a square of fabric smoothed across a bed that needed the touch. We made lunch from what was there, toast and eggs, and the last of the soup that had waited in the back of the fridge for a day that required comfort. No garnish, no art, food that tells the truth. We ate without performing. After Caleb carried the bowls to the sink and washed while Vanessa dried, I put things where they know to live. No one narrated the cooperation. That is how you know it is real. Before they left to pick up some groceries, Vanessa stood by the sill and noticed the tiny green tip again. She asked if she could be the one to water it today. I handed her the small can, and she poured with 2 hands, slow enough to be sure the surface accepted the gift. She looked up, not for approval but to share the sight. The plant did what living things do when given what they need. It did not speak. It showed. At the door, Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out an old key. The metal dulled by years of easy entrance. He rested it in my palm without drama. He said he would like a new one when he had earned it. I closed my fingers around the weight and felt something inside me answer. We stood there long enough for the afternoon to remind us that life keeps going, even when the important part of a day sits right at the threshold. When they were gone, the house held a different quiet. Not the strained hush of a room avoiding an argument, the hush of a chapel after a hymn ends, and everyone keeps listening anyway. I rinsed the vase one more time just to hear clear water make a clean sound. I lifted the can and gave the pots a small drink. The new tip leaned toward light with a confidence I recognized. Camera people always talk about how to end a story. Pull back. Let the frame widen. Invite the eye to rest. If a lens had been in the corner today, it would have seen sunlight lengthen over the tile and a woman standing steady with a watering can. It would have heard the slow trickle and the quiet sigh of leaves, accepting what was offered. It would have watched the room decide to be kind. People like to say you win a house by defending it. I have learned you win a home by learning who to welcome and when. Sometimes, to reclaim a place, you do not need to push anyone out. You invite peace in, and then you keep it on purpose. The coffee grew cold on the counter. I warmed it again and tasted it. It tasted like morning earned the right to be called good. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.